Yeah, testing. There we go. Thanks. All right. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Welcome. I'm Nick Benequista. I'm the Senior Director at the Center for International Media Assistance at the National Endowment for Democracy. And this session is From Tokenistic to Transformative: Youth Inclusion in the Democratic Governance of Technology. To open the session, I'm pleased to introduce Damon Wilson, who is the President and CEO of the National Endowment for Democracy, an independent, nonprofit foundation that supports the development of democratic institutions around the world. Damon, thanks very much for being with us.
Thanks so much, Nick, and thanks for everyone for coming out today. I'm going to just start with the obvious. Democracy is in a really tough spot right now. It's in a tough spot. We're having this debate, this discussion in the context of what is a consequential moment for democracy, and that can sound like a rhetorical point. It can sound like a little bit of a throwaway line. But when I was more along your age, when I was beginning my professional career, we had oxygen in our back with that we didn't even understand that we were riding the crest of what became known as the third democratic wave. And we really felt that we had a step in our beat, that we had an incredible opportunity, a very bright future ahead. And boom, boom. Where have we been in the past 20 years? We know it's been a democratic recession from Freedom House and others, but it's actually worse than that. It's worse than that, in part because of part of what we're going to talk about. Globalization, technology, which has been so empowering, has also created an environment that's led to fragmentation, incentivized polarization that has really complicated the element of democracy today. So when I got to the endowment, I was really concerned about how your generation, how the next generation is ambivalent. What's your perception? How do you think about the relationship between people and their government? And ambivalence towards democracy creates a really dangerous environment for democracy. So when I got to the endowment, a place that's been around for 40 years, I said, we need to lean in our work around democracy to think about how we lean in on everything digital and tech, how we lean in on everything related to arts and culture, and how we lean into everything related to technology, to youth and next generation. And this wasn't just an idea of an investment strategy. This is about projecting the way that we engage on these issues around the world so that it is attuned to a next generation. It is attuned to speaking to people around the world in a way that they can relate to and connect to, and that's a task for us. So in the Republic of Korea, when Seoul and this government said they wanted to reach out and do the summit, hosting the Summit for Democracy, and they wanted to do an emphasis on youth and technology and democracy, we're all over it. That's exactly an intersection where we think there is promise for the future. And it's really powerful to be here in Korea, in a place where you talk to government officials who have like very great distance to BTS or Blackpink or something like that. They understand the power of the Korean wave, but it seems to like it wasn't all that intentional. And this concept of how the Korean wave that has demonstrated how creativity, how freedom of expression can galvanize people around the world. And it's a Korean wave that's driven by the digital fabric that binds us globally. And I think that's really significant that this isn't just, we're not here in Seoul because people like that music and like the entertainment. Yes, it is entertainment, but it is underpinned by a set of values and principles that first made it possible, second are reflected in the creativity of the content, and become a real source of attraction, whether you're a North Korean kid or you're somewhere across the, I was sitting yesterday with the foreign minister from Gambia. He's like, my kids are in love with Korean culture. It's a power that we need to think of as not being devoid of values. Why does it exist? How can we embrace that creativity, the expression, the freedom of expression that many conservative folks would react against to, and seeing that as a powerful. So I think it's fitting today that we're discussing the role of youth participation in democratic governance and technology and how important that is for rebuilding global solidarity based on norms such as freedom of expression, creativity, and inclusion. We talked a lot about that inclusion aspect yesterday. Of course, young people are the largest demographic on the internet. Like, that seems obvious, and yet it's not the largest voice and component shaping policies around the internet. And the relationship of the next generation with the internet, emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, it is going to shape this collective future. Technology policies profoundly shape the online experiences and digital rights of youth. They influence what content and information young people can access, their exposure to manipulative disinformation and tactics and narratives, and the safeguard in place to protect their online privacy and safety. And yet you think about that and how the next generation and young people are largely underrepresented in the forums and the political processes and the decision-making bodies that shape the norms and standards. And we even heard the Cuban delegate who was talking about wanting to revert some of this process to more government-to-government approaches and undermining a multi-stakeholder approach, which has to be the avenue through which the next generation has a seat at the table. And so I think we've seen, and we have already seen in the 24 hours that we've been here in Seoul, that when young people are involved, they can be transformational. I don't know if you were paying attention to the long speeches yesterday. The only one I really remember is Paola Galvez, the youngest person who spoke on stage at the keynote yesterday. She got it. She understood what we're talking about, why we're here, and she captured our imagination. We heard that from Mia Møhring on stage yesterday, from Kira YOUthDIG as well. And Paolo said, youth communities are active at the forefront of global advocacy and democracy movements from Hong Kong to Iran, Venezuela to Peru. Youth are diverse and increasingly campaigning for action. However, seats for youth are limited, and when they are available, in most cases, it's the youth session. It's the youth advisory board where youth talk to youth. And while young people have the potential, we don't yet have the power. But Luis this morning, when she kicked us off, Luis from Kenya, I don't think she's with us here, but Luis Mamakamba, she said, we will make the table. We will claim that space. And to be honest, that's why we're really pleased that the Korean hosts said, we're serious. We want next generation technology to be at the heart of the conversation. So we started with ministers yesterday. We're going to heads of state tomorrow. And this is the bridging gap to hear from you, to be part of this today. So at the endowment, this is part of our commitment. It's part of the bloodstream. It's how we need to roll by integrating the next generation, projecting the concept that democracy is the future, not the past. And we're putting our mouth to where we speak. We're putting investments in this. We're proud to have hosted the Hereford Youth Fellowship as part of our World Movement for Democracy, because we understand you bring the ideas, the skill, the energy, to see, I think we have some of our colleagues here from Nigeria, to see our partners in Nigeria that have said, no, we're going to partner with Big Brother to actually get these civic messages to populations all across the continent. That brilliance came from a 22-year-old. It's not coming from somebody who's older than me. And those are the types of ideas, the venture capital, the partners that we're really excited to be supporting. If your generation takes this for granted, is ambivalent, succumbs to the siren song of the populists and autocrats that give us easy answers, we're in for a bumpy ride. We're in for a bumpy ride. It's not been a great 2 decades. It's up to what you're trying to do, how you think about shaping this future, of whether that trend can be stopped and ultimately reversed. We won't know when it happens, but I'm pretty confident that the power we've seen coming from Korean Wave, that power of a next generation in shaping this community, this digitally native community, that those can be the forces that ultimately will allow folks to look back and say, and this is when the fourth democratic wave began. So we're counting on you. Nick, I'm going to turn it over to you. Really looking forward to the conversation. Thanks so much for everybody's participation and engagement.
Thanks, Damon, for such an excellent welcome. By way of a little bit of background, the Republic of Korea approached the National Endowment for Democracy a few months ago to ask a favor. They had decided that the theme of the summit was going to be on democracy for future generations, and they reached out to the NED to ask if we could host some consultations at the nexus of youth, technology, and democracy. Now, as you've heard from Damon, those three themes are central to the work of the NED, but there's a lot of things that connect those three themes. And so we sat down with our partners, and we sat down with our core institutes, the affiliated institutes, the National Democratic Institute, the International Republican Institute, Solidarity Center, the Center for International Private Enterprise, and we decided how we might focus our consultations on this issue. What we discussed as we figured out our focus was there's a lot of debate about whether technology is a better tool for the Democrats or the authoritarians. You hear that debate a lot in how we discuss technology, but that misconstrues the fundamental challenge that we face with technology and democracy. Digital technologies, including the internet, are a complex domain of competing forces. I think we've learned that from the academic work on this area. And it's the playing ground, it's the playing field for democratic struggles. It is the architecture and the infrastructure for the public sphere. And it's not about whether it's a better tool for Democrats or a better weapon for the autocrats. It's about who sets the norms and standards that set the rules of the game that really matters today. And the real struggle of our time is that. And the real struggle for future generations is about who will set those norms and standards, those who care about distributing power equally in our societies or those who seek to concentrate power over those tools. So this panel is about the vital role that young people play in that struggle. And I've been really relieved, I've been surprised to learn that the UN definition for youth is very inclusive. So it's up to 35 years of age. So I'm past the mark, unfortunately. But I would be curious to know in this room how many of you consider yourselves young by the UN definition and are working on the nexus of technology and democracy. By show of hands, who? How many people? All right. That's great. It's great representation. I mean, this panel is about your efforts and about how the international community can help support and strengthen your efforts. So with that, I'll introduce our excellent panelists. I would say at least half of which probably fit under the youth category, if not more. First of all, to my right, we have Nadia Tjahja, a PhD fellow and coordinator of the Digital Governance Cluster at the United Nations University and a YOUthDIG coordinator. YOUthDIG is one of the vehicles for youth participation. So Nadia has been really at the forefront of these efforts to fight for youth participation in internet governance and digital governance. And you'll see much of her work at the Comparative Regional Integration Studies Center and at the Center for Digitalization, Democracy, and Innovation. She has an excellent policy brief, which I have somewhere here, the title of which was
Youth Participation in Internet Governance?
Yeah, it really is like it's a 6-page, 6 pages of wisdom on this issue that she'll be talking about soon. To her right, we have Elonnai, Managing Director of the Global Network Initiative, where she works to strengthen and grow this a unique multi-stakeholder organization, GNI, working for the advancement of freedom of expression and privacy. Elonnai is also a member of several multi-stakeholder initiatives, including the Freedom Online Coalition's Advisory Network and the GIFCT Independent Advisory Committee. She's also a member of the Christchurch Call Advisory Network. I think what Elonnai brings to this discussion today is a really interesting perspective on how we get private sector to care about youth engagement and inclusion. To her right, we have Camilo Alfredo Arratia Toledo, Open Internet for Democracy leader and a project analyst at Internet Bolivia Foundation. He's a sociologist, a researcher, and a specialist in global studies of gender, education, and development. He was previously the digital ambassador in Sweden for the Swedish Institute and a recipient of the SISGP Scholarship Global Swede 2021 Award. He's also worked for the World Bank, many other accomplishments in his background. And finally, we have Mia Møhring Larsen, Senior Tech Advisor to Denmark's Tech Ambassador at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Denmark. She is been leading the Tech for Democracy initiative by Denmark, which is looking precisely to promote democracy, human rights, inclusion, information integrity in the world. And she's had a leading role also in the FOC, where she heads the Task Force on Information Integrity, the FOC being the Freedom Online Coalition. So we've assembled a panel today of experts that bring a variety of perspectives, private sector, government, and two of our leading advocates for youth inclusion in digital governance. So to start us off, I'd like to turn to Nadia. I think one of the things that we've learned in these consultations is that it's not just add youth and stir. That there are real challenges that we have to confront to getting young people meaningfully, not just tokenistically, but meaningfully engaged in shaping technology. The multi-stakeholder model, which we've heard so much about, which holds as a core principle inclusion, is under threat. So young people have a double challenge. You not only have to fight to preserve the multi-stakeholder model, you also have to fight for your position within the multi-stakeholder model. And you've been at the forefront of these efforts. How's it going?
Oh, that's a very interesting question, but I would like to start here. So when we say add youth, most of the time people think of youth as newcomers. So then we kind of are associated, oh, so you're young, so you're new to this thing. But in my coordination role at the Youth Dialogue on Internet Governance, which is YOUthDIG, I've read over thousands of people's motivation to be involved in digital governance. And you have 19-year-olds who are saying, I set up my own cloud computing server in 2014. And since then, I've taught my friends how to use it so we can work on it together and set up businesses and being involved in these components. And at the same time, we're also receiving applications from governments where you have 28-year-olds who are specialists in their field, and their field is being confronted by digitalization, and they want to be involved. And these are all youth people, but they're not newcomers. These are people who have interest and who are really working on how digitalization is impacting them and wanting to share that with policymakers and decision makers who are changing kind of the scope of how our digital future is going to look like. So young people encompasses not only this huge age range until 35, but also a variety of different backgrounds and expertise. So not only are we then fighting for a seat at the table, we also need to have the meaningful participation to be at that seat of the table. So what is really great is that we acknowledge that young people should be there. But I could be sitting here and all of you could be on Instagram right now. All of you could be working on an email. All of you could be looking up your next piece of homework that needs to be submitted or an email that came in from your boss and that you're panicking about. It doesn't matter where my expertise comes from or how long I've been working on something or what I've been doing. If we're not having a dialogue, if we're not thinking about these type of things together, is that still then meaningful, even though I bring expertise, even though I've been involved and a wonderful opportunity to be meeting so many different people. But I'm not asking you to ask me questions. Perhaps you already know many of the things I've already said. I'm not asking you to disagree with me either, preferably not. But I want to just see your perspectives. A dialogue is not only about understanding, agreeing and disagreeing. It's not about contestation per se. It can also be about understanding different perspectives. Where are the differences to meet a new goal, or where are the similarities of where we can start taking on challenges together. So once we have that dialogue, once that voice gets integrated, it's not only about me having a seat at the table, but we as seats on the table, then having a meaningful conversation with you, giving you the responses based on our expertise, that we can have a meaningful dialogue that allows us to have meaningful participation. And the concern that then what happens, and what we've done also, what was also raised in our keynote here, was that when we don't have these meaningful conversations in these type of spaces, young people will go and create their own. We start meta-participating. We're not participating in decision-making anymore. We start meta-participating, where we are actually deciding who needs to be in the room. What are the topics that we're going to talk about, and how are we going to shape them to bring that to people who are then going to meaningfully engage? We are taking then ownership of this opportunity. And I think I'm just going to stop here, but I think it's really important that we think about how we look at participation is also that it needs to be meaningful. And I encourage you to share your thoughts and ideas, because without your thoughts and ideas, I don't know who I'm talking to otherwise.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Nadia. So, I mean, I think it has been so impressive to learn about how young people, even when they are excluded, find ways to create spaces, dialogic spaces, really inclusive spaces, outside sometimes of the spheres of influence. And I think one of the lessons that we have learned in this consultation is that the international community needs to see some of these interesting spaces that young people are created and connect them to the spaces where decision making is really made. And that's a great transition to Camilo, actually, who is doing precisely that in Bolivia. So, you know, I think when you talk about multi-stakeholderism, it's easy to pay lip service to this sort of thing, but secretly or quietly, people maybe express some skepticism, especially with regard to the youth. Do they really care about digital governance? Don't they have more important things to talk about? And, you know, is it really possible to do multi-stakeholderism in rural areas, in countries that aren't digitally connected, you know, where there's a digital divide? So, Camilo, you've been working to engage people, young people included, on issues of privacy in small towns in Bolivia. And you, what do you say to the skeptics based on the experience you've had doing that work?
Yeah, thank you, Nick. Yeah, I have been working with a lot of young people, especially in rural areas and indigenous communities. From my experience, I think that sometimes people who knows me, they know that I like local processes, and I think there is a strong tendency sometimes in national levels when the young people is not really included, or there are some councils or some things that are there, but they don't really have really power, right, in these power structures about making decisions. But when I start working in the rural communities and small local communities, then I realized that you can do a change there, right? Because sometimes in the national levels, it's so complicated to create an agenda, because when then you have something better things to do, especially in countries that we are not as developed as other countries, as they say. But in the local levels, we can demonstrate that we can do a lot of things, right? Because, for example, we have like this work in these small communities where young people, you think sometimes that young people only serves to see TikTok, Instagram, or something like that. But when you see what they are creating in this kind of social media, and when you understand what they are doing, it's expression of politics too, right? Just to do a TikTok or something funny in TikTok is not just for entertaining, it's also to show what they are living. If you see the background of when they record the video, for instance, that you can see an expression, right? And we try to work with that and try to involve the people that is making decisions in the local communities. And as is it a local community, as it is a small place, then people got engaged better, right? And I can testify that it was so fun to have these young people teaching these decision makers, teach them how to use TikTok, how to use Instagram, and then they understood. Because sometimes people that is adult, they are afraid because they don't know what people is doing, right? So I think it's a nice way to work in these local levels, and I think that young people is the bridge to this gap about making decisions about youth participation. And we have good results because in some rural communities and local levels, we have like these laws that we have bills that pass, and we have a lot of engagement. And sometimes people believe that, oh, maybe you need water or you need other kind of things, but they also want to be involved in this digital world, right? And I think we have the right to be too, even if we have other necessities. I think that young people want to be involved, right, at the same time.
Just a couple follow-up questions for Nadia and for Camilo. First, for Camilo, a slightly indiscreet question that you often don't ask. This kind of work at the local level, like how much does it cost? And I ask because I think it's, going back to my earlier remarks, it's sort of assumed that it's too hard to do. It's too difficult to really engage people at this level. But we're not talking about
Yeah.
huge amounts of money.
Yeah, actually, it's not that. I mean, of course, we want more money always. But I will give an example. We have some projects that is $10,000 for a year, just for a year, and we make miracles with that. And it's so few money when you realize how much money it is when you search other kind of processes. But with that small money, we make a lot, and with young people just being very active, because we find different kind of methodologies, for instance, because sometimes people just believe that the social media, young people only they need to aggregate and talk about that, but it's not like that. They have methodologies as art, they have music, and they have the young people, they just have a different way to show an expression of politics for democracy. And I think that it could be cheap, but if we have, imagine if we have more money, what could we do in local levels? Because then we have a really strong national repercussion. And with this small project of $10,000, then we have a lot of repercussion, and all the communities want to do the same. And we don't have $10,000 for each community, unfortunately, sometimes, but we have to prioritize. But I think it's so few money if you think about it, but I think we need more. We need, I think, young people very compromised, and we can do, as young people do for universities, with small money, you can just eat whatever or something like that. I think it also works when you want to do something.
Thanks, Camilo. Nadia, you've been involved deeply in the YOUthDIG, part of the YOUthDIG multi-stakeholder platform for internet governance, as well as the youth efforts, the youth network at the IGF, the Internet Governance Forum. When you look back at your work here, who are the allies that you count on internationally, and who would you like to see some more support from among the big multilateral institutions, big NGOs, countries? Who is providing you guys strength, and who needs to provide more?
I think that they should all be our allies at any time, at every point. So I don't want to say specifically who, because I want to talk about where. So when we look at these different topics and we different communities, we can't always say, oh, well, there's this one organization and we rely on this one organization to take care of the entire world. We can't do that. So there are, even within specific organizations, you have those who are focused on content and you have those who focused on community. So for example, if you think about a business, you have the people who work on policy and you have the people who work on, for example, corporate social responsibility or community building. If you're looking at an association, you have those people who are looking at the topic of the mission of the organization and those who are working on membership. So you see those different spaces. When we then navigate all these different organizations, we try to find people who have similar energy so that we can build on each other's strengths and move forward. To say that some people are not as much involved is because we also need to choose to reach out. Because if every single person is here looking at the UN to save us, and we are all directing our attention towards the UN, we are all directing our attention to Microsoft or Google, etc. There's only so much capacity people have. But when we do meet people, every single individual person in this room, every person that you're going to meet at this conference, every single person has a strength, an idea, a way to move forward. And having that natural curiosity to connect with people and wanting to learn more about them and for them to learn more about you, you never know who can be your next ally and from what corner of the world they may be, what kind of background. You have no idea whether sustainability and health or internet and submarine cables or what it may be. It could be beyond an imagination and a future that we haven't seen before just because you chose to be curious.
Great, thanks, Nadia. And that's a perfect segue to Elonnai. I think, look, not relying on one institution to be the champion for this and is exactly right. Elonnai, at GNI, the Global Network Initiative, you've been working to try to get the private sector to care about the views of young people, and not just as consumers and not just as another data point in their business models, but to really care about how young people feel about the technology that they're building and to involve them in co-creating that technology. So what does it take to convince private companies to care about young people as a stakeholder, and what have you learned about how to do that well?
Yeah, so thank you for that question and for the opportunity to be on this panel. And I think as Damon kind of outlined in the beginning, the youth are driving innovation, right? They are driving change through technology. They are shaping how platforms and services are being used. And at the same time, their lives are deeply intertwined with the digital, of how they learn, how they communicate, how they interact with others, their livelihoods, etc. And a lot of the risks that are on platforms and that companies need to be worrying about speak to youth users. And one way that and so companies need to really make sure that their platforms are safe, that they are empowering, that they are enabling spaces. And one way that companies do this is through stakeholder engagement, often through due diligence efforts. And I think stakeholder engagement is really growing as a norm. We're actually seeing it starting to be part of regulation. We're starting to see policymakers really push companies to start undertaking stakeholder engagement. And I think it's important that there's also dedicated effort within companies to engage with youth, to understand how their products are being used, what are the risks that they're facing, what do they need to be thinking about when they move into a new market where the user base will be predominantly youth. Now, but when we talk about stakeholder engagement, just like meaningful participation, there's also questions about what is meaningful stakeholder engagement. And something that's inherent in stakeholder engagement is power dynamics, right? So like, who's got the information, who's giving information, what are they doing with that information, who's actually making decisions around it? And I would just say, I think the OECD outlines some really good principles to help guide what is meaningful stakeholder engagement that companies can look towards, right? Is it inclusive? Is it two-way? Is it undertaken in good faith? Is it ongoing, et cetera? And so there's a lot of work being done towards trying to really strengthen the stakeholder engagement and create deeper guidelines around it. What kind of information do individuals need to be provided with to actually even meaningfully react or engage on products or answer questions from companies? How can companies be accountable for the input that they are receiving? And when I think about stakeholder engagement with youth, I think we probably need to be doing more thinking of are there particular areas or questions that the youth, companies need input from youth. And then I think there's a question also about scaling engagement. There's definitely a difference between engaging with a small group of, individuals who are in this space versus trying to really get a large spectrum of voices to understand how products are being used and what the impact is. And then I also wanted to say that, so one, congratulations on the report. And it outlines 5 areas of focus, I think, to help empower the youth. The entry points for all, sustainable coordination, a seat at the table, strong institutions, and youth innovation and creativity. And I think companies can really contribute to these, right? To creating empowering spaces. So not just engaging with youths about like how are their products being used and what their experience is, but how can they enable youth to have a seat at the table? How can they give legitimacy to their voices? And we see things like tech policy fellowships, research grants, scholarships. All of these are really important initiatives that companies are undertaking. Meta's launched something called Our Feed, Our Future in the EU, which is trying to bring youth in the EU into regulatory decision and conversations. This is great. I think it also needs to, one, we need to see other companies start to bring these in, right? This could be part of like corporate sustainability. How do we build these programs into, other commitments that companies need to live up to? So other companies, but also across jurisdictions and regions with a focus on the global majority. Something that really stood out to me in the report was that it said that sometimes in authoritarian contexts, engagement with the private sector is the best avenue for youth to drive change. And I think that's really important to think about and to remember. And it actually places a very large responsibility on companies to be engaging, to be empowering, to be open to engaging and working with youth. And I guess the last point I wanted to make is that I think multi-stakeholder initiatives can also be really important interlocers for this, right? Engaging with the companies is not always an easy task. They're really big. It's hard to access them. These are challenges that G&I tries to work through on an everyday basis. How do we create a trusted space, develop relationships where change can actually happen and stakeholders' voices can be heard? And so I just want to highlight the role that multi-stakeholder initiatives can play in empowering youth, not only in engaging with the corporate sector, but also I think kind of hitting at a number of the challenges that were identified in that report, right? The need for mentorship, the need for networks, the need for trusted relationships, the need for coordination across mechanisms, the need for sustained engagement. All of these networks, multi-stakeholder networks, encompass in kind of a part of the fabric of what they are. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Elonnai. And I neglected to plug the report that Laura Schwartz-Henderson is in the back. Do you want to raise your hand, Laura? Laura is our excellent researcher and consultant, and she helped us to synthesize all of the rich lessons from the consultations that we held in the run-up to the summit into the lessons and recommendations that Elonnai was referring to. So this is in draft form now, and we're hoping to hear more from you guys today and over the coming days. And we'll have a revised version of that report that hopefully reflects some of the deliberations here at the Summit for Democracy as well. Turning to another ally, we, are, as I mentioned before, Mia has been at the forefront really of Denmark's efforts to use diplomatic power to open a space for citizen participation. And this is so important now, I think, recognizing that policies on technology in the US, in the EU, and in China affect the whole world. But all citizens, but especially young people who don't live in those countries, are really disempowered when it comes to having an influence over those policies and the way it plays out in their lives, in terms of the future of work, in terms of their democracy, in terms of their privacy and safety and security online. So what is the obligation of technology-rich states to global forms of inclusion in policy and regulation, and how should countries like Denmark fulfill that role? What have you learned about that, Mia?
Thank you so much, Nick, and thank you so much for having me and having Denmark on this panel. It's always a tough one to go last because there's been so many great things that has been said from the other panelists. I think I first just have to say personally what you said, Nadia, about curiosity really, really resonates with me. I think it's so important, and it goes to one of the points that I wanted to elaborate a little bit on. I think first I would say, so I'm based in California. I'm in the office of Denmark's tech ambassador. It's a cross-cutting office between Copenhagen and Silicon Valley. The reason why we're out there and why we started the initiative 7 years ago is that I think somebody in our administration thought that Mark Zuckerberg and the likes probably don't wake up every day thinking, what can I do for Denmark today? So we're a really small nation of 5 million, 6 million people. And it's important for us to be where the technology is happening. One thing that's important for us, besides from bringing Danish perspectives to the tech companies of the world in both Silicon Valley and beyond, is that we also need to raise the global concerns. So not just the concerns of the Danish governments, but the concerns that we know are part of concerns for global civil society, for other countries, and really trying to elevate those issues with the tech industry so that it's not just us bringing knowledge from Silicon Valley back to Denmark or other countries, but that we're also bringing global concerns to Silicon Valley, because Silicon Valley is a nice place. Sun is shining, the houses are nice, there's a lot of electrical vehicles and self-driving cars, and it's a great place. Elonnai knows this too, but I don't think that a lot of people wake up every day thinking what their technology will do to the world. So that's, I think, just to say that that's something that's really important for us as a small nation, but it's also important for, I think, the broader message of really incorporating inclusion into the technological development. And that definitely goes to including youth as well. You're going to hear from Denmark's Prime Minister tomorrow. She's chairing the first panel on youth. I'm sure she's going to talk about the fact that I think Denmark's society has been built on social and political movements. And so often young people are at the forefront. I often say that I don't think I would be able to do my job, frankly, if we didn't have the collaboration and partnership with civil society, with young people, with a diverse set of stakeholders, with other multi-stakeholder initiatives, and with tech companies. Because we need that knowledge and we need the guidance to know where to go. And so often it's young people that possess the openness, the curiosity, the boldness to look around the corner in ways that we, as we grow older, might not be so open to doing. So I think that's my long answer to say, yes, that is a responsibility that we have as technology. I think you said technology rich. It could be, I mean, sometimes, the conversations are so centered in the global north. So I think as countries that are sometimes overrepresented in those conversations, we do have a responsibility to both bring in those diverse perspectives, and we can only bring them in if we actually speak with other stakeholders, but also to make sure that young people have a seat at the table. But what does that mean? Is that inclusion? To have a seat at the table if they just go home and then it becomes a tokenistic thing to be doing? I think those partnerships take time and you need to keep doing it. It's a sustained effort. You need to understand and you need to know each other. If I am going to take the advice from Camilo, I need to know you and I need to trust you and I need to understand where you're coming from. And you need to know that I have good intentions as well, that I actually will bring that to another place where we can actually act on it. And that takes time. And that's, I think, one of the biggest things we learned from the Tech for Democracy initiative that we launched as part of our commitment to the Summit for Democracy is it does take time to build those relationships and partnerships. But that's where we need to start. And then we just need to keep doing it.
Thanks, Mia. I want to stay with you for 1 minute. I have a quick follow-on question. I think one of the things that we've observed talking to people working in this space is the particular challenge that young people have, not only outside of those technology-rich countries, but in one of the countries where 72% of the world's population lives in authoritarian states at the moment. So many of the young activists that we're talking to live in countries where their governments don't want them to participate on these issues. And so how do you as a diplomat, what is your responsibility, your role? What can you do to help mobilize their participation in this space?
So I think there's a couple of things that I wanted to say to that, is that I think even if I can understand why that's really frustrating, and I mean, we can do a lot as democratic governments that cares about inclusion really deeply to promote those voices and elevate them to a level where they're also heard. But I would say, I think even if there are countries that don't have the very long-standing historic tradition of really working really closely with civil society, I do think that there is almost like an international consensus or convergence to inclusion being a really important element in our digital future and in technology. And we hear this a lot of places. We've heard this here. We've heard it in several UN conversations on digital governance and technology conversations, that inclusion really is at the core of that. And I think that's at least something we can leverage, because if you care about inclusion and benefits of technology for all, no matter which country you are, and it does seem like there is starting to be some consensus around that, then you should be involving youth and civil society. And I think we have something that we can build on there to make sure that we can only create the societies with technology that meets the needs of citizens, and especially of the future generations to come, if they are involved.
Great. One final question for Elonnai, and then I have a speed round question before we open it up to you guys and your questions and comments. Elonnai, young people are particularly skeptical about the private sector as a partner. Just, is there an example that comes to mind which you feel like that kind of stakeholder engagement has moved the needle a little bit in terms of democratic rights and norms?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for example, that initiative from Meta, I think, is an interesting one, right? Our Feed, Our Future, and they collaborated with a local NGO called Think Young to implement that program. And so I think it's a collaboration that can be useful to look at. I think I actually wanted to maybe come to the point that you asked Mia on the shrinking, well, I would frame it as shrinking civic spaces, right? So like, what do we do about the fact that we are talking all about youth engagement in the context of shrinking civic spaces globally? And how do we start to address a lot of the underlying issues of why those spaces are shrinking towards youth empowerment? Like, if we want to get to youth empowerment, we also need to address the shrinking civic spaces. And I would come back to multi-stakeholder initiatives and networks and just talk about the power of collective voice, and something that I have experienced. So before I was GNI, I was the COO for the Center of Internet and Society based in Bangalore in India. And often when there were messages that were difficult to convey, or advocacy efforts difficult to convey in the Indian context, turning toward global networks to collective voices and sharing those messages through those was a really powerful way to still convey what needed to be conveyed, to leverage the strength of having multiple people support that message, to say it in different avenues, in different jurisdictions, to different policymakers. And so, yeah, just to say that those networks are really important in amplifying the voice of youth.
That's great. I'm so glad you brought it back to the context of closing space. And I think you began to answer what was going to be my final speed round question is, what to invest in. If you had one thing, the one thing that makes a real difference, I know there's lots of things that we could try to strengthen that helps to empower youth to engage meaningfully. But one thing that makes the difference, speed round. Should we start with Mia, Camilo, Elonnai, and then end with where we started with Nadia?
It's a tough one to only get to invest in one thing, but I know there's been a lot of talk about literacy, I think, at this conference. I would say I sometimes find that it's overlooked in like bigger international conversation, and I don't think it can be said enough how important it is. If I think of my own background, I was always interested, I'm a political scientist, and I was always interested in social and political change, but I never thought that I would necessarily do the tech stuff. And I think that's actually the case for a lot of young women. If people and women and girls are going to be engaged, then there needs to be more literacy in the space of digital tech and internet questions, because that is still something that I think kind of scares people a bit away from that. And I am so thrilled that there are so many organizations that just, that prove that young people are knowing and savvy, and they know about the digital rights, and we shouldn't just treat them as victims of something because they know, and they often know more than us. But I still do think that there is a need to invest in the literacy on digital rights, and for young people to be engaged on that.
Thanks, Mia. And I think one of the things that we heard from the consultations is we hear a lot about digital and media literacy, but it's digital policy literacy in particular, knowing how the infrastructure gets made, who's in control of it, and the processes that are available to have an influence over that. That's knowledge that's not common knowledge, I think. Camilo?
Yeah, thank you. Also, it's too hard to just I have two, but I think the first one, I think I should be like, we have to, if we want to empower youth participation, I think we have to fund local, regional processes. As I say, we have like, I have a good example of the YOUthDIG IEF, for example, last year in Cartagena, and we were the clear example of how the diversity, indigenous communities, rural communities, some small companies, some big companies also were present and showing it was like a party of democracy, I don't know, of participation. It was so beautiful. And I think we have to invest on that, because sometimes these local processes like IGF, which I do not agree that it's going to be in Saudi, because I think many youth diverse participation is going to be held there. But I think we have to support this kind of processes, and not only economically, which is very crucial, but also we have to like make these processes worth it. Like, I don't know, like to publish what we did, to make these debates, I don't know, to show in the big events, and because if we handle this and we do this, then we will have really meaningful youth participation, because sometimes in these big events there are some young people that they have their personal agenda, and it's people that is not living in the local regions. They just maybe some researchers, sometimes PhD, which is good, I think, but they are not in the local community sometimes. So I think it's very important to support them, because then it's people that is actually working in their communities, and then they could do this big jump to another big events because they represent. So I think I will invest in these local, regional processes.
Terrific, Camilo. Thanks. Elonnai?
So I think maybe I'll take this opportunity to just say that one stakeholder that we haven't talked about yet in this conversation, which I think is key towards enabling youth, is philanthropy and foundations. And when we talk about investment and what's on their agendas, that we need to make sure youth is also on the agenda of philanthropy and on foundations. So they're giving civil society support to have fellowship programs that bring in the youth, that build the capacity, that enable them to work in standards bodies, in the IGF, et cetera, that they are enabling civil society to have strong institutions that youth can work in, et cetera. And so I wanted to take that opportunity to also bring that stakeholder into this conversation, because I think it's an important one. We look at kind of like, how do we need to build this ecosystem so youth is really holistically brought into the agenda across the board.
Absolutely. Nadia?
So I'm going to build on what I was saying earlier about being curious about each other, but also about what Mia was saying about trust takes time. So the resource that what I would like to invest in is community building, but not a community there is just one community, but how do we see each other? We always saw youth as newcomers, but what we see now slowly changing, and it's a choice whether we choose that we want to see this change. But what we are trying to do at YOURDIG is we have stakeholders now who are seniors in their jobs, and they are looking for the young people in the room. They want to go and find their opinion simply. First of all, sometimes they organize sessions and they need to fill the room. So there is one thing, but mostly they realize that you can't make youth interested about policy work if they don't understand the context, and who better to describe the context than the people working on it. when you build a community, when you have trust, when you're curious about each other, you are able to exchange with each other and build context around topics that you never knew about. There's so many things that I could learn from private sector, from civil society, and from government, from the different countries that we're all coming from the different backgrounds that we're coming from, that provides different context so we have a better understanding of how to move forward. If we have that community feeling in a sense of we are always trying to see where we can find how we can interact with each other and giving each other the benefit of belonging. When you belong somewhere, we always give each other kind of the benefit of the doubt of trying to include someone. Then we are already making a step forward into this progress where we can work with each other's strength for progress and innovation. And so I encourage you to build your own communities and connect them. Now we're all going back, but then let's stay in touch together and build our communities together.
Thanks, Nadia. I would say, look, my experience engaging and talking to all of you over the past few months has been really inspiring, and it is a cause of optimism. I think this, like the natural curiosity, the value of inclusion that I've seen among the youth activists here in this room, I think it really is the vehicle for democratic renewal. I mean, I'm totally convinced. So thanks very much to our panelists. We have maybe 2 minutes, 5 minutes. So we could take a couple of questions. I would like to privilege young voices, and I see 2 of them with their hands raised. So Kat will bring the microphone over.
Hello, thank you so much for the amazing panel, first of all. So I have a year and a half that I'll be young for, so I'll quickly start. The thing is, when we talk about technology governance and youth, we know there's big tech, right, and that is designing all of this infrastructure. So I want to mention what happened in Turkey's general elections last year is that we saw videos generated by young people inciting violence right after the election. So there were videos where if a certain candidate wins, there will be a fun thing happening, and there were counter-strike videos of people being dead in the streets, which was just incitement of like internal conflict, 5 million views. Young people think it's funny, but it's actually promoting a lot of violence. And the moment we made a report about it, they were all removed in a day. So I was just thinking, you need to have power to influence. How do we turn young people into a counterpower to hold big tech companies accountable? And when we think of repressive environments, the thing is, we don't get a seat on the table sometimes if you're in a particularly challenged country. The thing is, youth involvement should not be a Western luxury. So how do you think that you can support if you have a certain say in a governance forum or like in any place? How do you make sure that some like country with like 5 million population and no market interest of big tech, how do you make sure that there are trust and safety initiatives? People with language skills getting hired in big tech companies. I think that really boils down to that. And so that's my message. But I also want to ask, we didn't really think about, so attention economy is the reason all of why this is happening, right? So you have to have addictive product to make sure that young people are using, and that's the basis of all of the bad problems happening. You make young people addicted. You scare them. So actually what we saw in Turkey a week ago was that there were videos where influencers were trying to frighten kids that their mom would die if they not like the video. But this is such a like local Turkish problem, right? So how do we make sure that big tech is accountable? And so that's my question. Do you think that like when you win, if you win in the attention economy, so in this economic context, do you think that we can really change big tech companies to do something that is against their economic interest in a way?
Great. Thanks very much. Next. Introduce yourself if you wish to.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much. My name is Eliud Luther. I'm from Nairobi, Kenya. I work in the digitizing of public procurement, specifically in Kenya and Namibia as well. Mine is more of a comment and specifically just sharing something on what you mentioned. I think the president mentioned around, especially in Kenya, young people have moved away from asking for a seat at the table to actually thinking around how to create the table. And so I'll just give context how we are doing that, but also on the point you mentioned around who do we see as our ally? So just for context, so I'm a researcher, and so in my daily work, I've really tried to understand the African context, as we call it in most cases. And so if you're aware, currently, 2 things are happening in Africa. One, is that there is a really growing and thriving digital ecosystem. And so we have, the penetration of devices, an example, very affordable devices that even to the rural areas, we have people accessing digital devices. We also have connectivity, and I'm talking about high-speed internet. The likes of Starlink are actually launching this high-speed internet in even the most remote areas of Africa. And so you're talking about a very connected landscape, but also where people are actually able to access internet, and not just internet, but high-speed internet. Then the last thing is what's happening is the digital skills. And so we've had a lot of programming, and this is especially from the UN agencies and other development organizations, really trying to spearhead how can we upskill Africans on digital skills. And so we've gotten to a level where there's a considerable sort of significant number of people who are actually very good in digital skills. The other thing that is happening is the growing number of young people. These young people are not just young, they're very energetic, they're super passionate, and they also have amazing ideas, and they're really trying to bring them to life. So one thing is happening, these two spaces are coming together. And so traditionally what we've seen, especially when it comes to youth inclusion or youth participation, we've seen traditionally it has been young people, this is pre-internet, young people waiting for the government to solve their problems. Then when the internet came, especially in the early 2000s, it was around young people ranting online on what the government is not doing. So you'll hear for raising, in the comment section mostly, just ranting about why is this not happening? Someone should do something about it. But currently what's happening is that young people are actually creating solutions and showcasing these solutions to this, like take an example, the government officials, for them to really see what we can do, not just what we complain about. And so this is to the point of who is our ally? I think we see our ally as technology. And so technology is our biggest ally because with technology, we are getting into rooms where I'll give you just a quick example. So when we were building our system, it's an e-procurement system, so trying to digitize the procurement process, the government officials will ask us, so we're leveraging the emerging technologies like AI and machine learning. And they'll ask, are you guys building ChatGPT? It's already there. So their understanding is really limited on what the digital ecosystem is all about. And we'll tell them, we're actually trying to make your process super efficient and of course making your work easier, but also just trying to flag some of the anomalies in your processes. And they'll be like, okay, now we want to listen to you. So on a table like that, it would mean that the young people have to actually lead the conversation. Because if we're not just joining in, we're actually coming with something brand new that has never happened. So it calls for us to actually lead that conversation. And so I think that's where we also need to be thinking, even as we build forward. It's around thinking, how can you create those spaces? And actually, because one thing I've learned, and this is my last point, is that leaders actually don't lead, they follow. And so if they follow, it's about what are we creating that they can tap into as opposed to waiting for them to create new spaces. Thank you.
Thanks, Eliud. I'm aware that in Kenya, they often refer to the spirit of entrepreneurialism and innovation colloquially as the hustler culture. And it's wonderful to hear that culture being directed at inclusion and rights and democratic innovation. That sounds remarkable, Eliud. We have one question, and it's a key question for the panel to close on. And if I've understood the crux of it, it's not just weak political youth participation from a position of weak political power, but also weak economic power. It's that double whammy. And in markets where the political power is weak and your economic power is weak, what do we do? It's been a theme a little bit of our conversations. Any final reflections on that very difficult but important question?
So I think on that, again, I would say turning to things like networks can be really powerful. Different actors need to come together, right? Like governments in the West need to support youth in global majority or in weaker contexts, philanthropy, etc. So I think it's really that needs to be a center point of the problem statement. And as actors working towards solving this need to work to address it. I wanted to actually maybe touch a little bit on what you were saying about private sector, right? And like, is it actually changing if we're in an attention economy? And there, I would just say that something that G&I works with companies to do is to commit to human rights and international human rights standards and frameworks, things like the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And there, that requires companies to put in place policies and processes, starting at the board level down into product design, to account for and address human rights impacts. And part of that includes doing things like due diligence, stakeholder engagement, human rights impact assessments. And all of those are small steps towards making sure there's redress mechanisms in place and that they're responsive to understanding what are the different impacts their products are having in different jurisdictions that they're moving into or different markets that they're moving into. So it's not the full answer and it doesn't necessarily fix everything, but I think having that due diligence that companies are doing and having more and more companies committing to undertake due diligence is a really key part of the solution.
Thanks. That's excellent. Nadia?
I'll start with collaboration. So in terms of trying to find solutions, sometimes with high-level stakeholders, it's not often accessible. And sometimes you don't even know where does the issue start, like at what level, and how do you integrate with that, and how can you influence that? And when we were talking about digital policy literacy, sometimes that's very overwhelming. If it's all legal or politics, it's not, it's completely opaque. But what we can do is there are mechanisms and structures where we can collaborate with each other, even just young people supporting each other in terms of starting with study visits. You have, for example, now the EU Africa funds that are available to collaborate to work on these new spaces that we're going to create, because the future leaders who are going to take on these spaces in government, in private sector, if they feel that they can change that kind of field by being present in them. I don't know how many of you are on TikTok following the millennial manager fad, but the millennial manager is the manager that is sitting in the spa taking their meeting. But and if you feel unwell, then the millennial manager say, just stay the day home. That's fine. Just take your time, come back when you're not sick, so that the rest of us don't get sick. So when we create that change of mindset by collaborating with each other and creating these spaces, then it's not a tomorrow it's solved issue. It is a long-term collaboration of wanting to work together that will allow us to create the future that we want to shape. And then mechanisms like the Asia Europe Foundation, who has funding to collaborate, the Erasmus Plus schemes, and maybe there are other opportunities for grants and funding. Let's just talk to each other and see what kind of opportunities there are. Even study visits can be so impactful and can change the lives of one person just by getting access to them. Let's start there, and hopefully we can keep coming back. Let's come back to this conversation over and over and over again, whether it's at the summit or if we just exchange contacts, that we can keep working on this together.
Any final words from that end of the table?
Maybe just one, if I understood the question, the first one correctly, on keeping or holding big tech or tech companies accountable. And you kind of, I think, was asking me at the beginning, Nick, as well. Well, then if you're not a Danish citizen that has a pretty amazing tech ambassador, if I can say so, without being biased, and she's not here, but what do you do if you don't have, or you're not a citizen of a country that's trying to do something, or if you're not an EU citizen that has the DSA? And I mean, we've still yet to see how that is entirely going to unfold, but we remain really, really positive. And we're hoping that it can be a part of a movement that we're seeing, where there's going to be, that companies are going to drive more investment towards the trust and safety teams. Hopefully, that's not something that we necessarily know yet, but there are reports showing that there is a drive towards more trust and safety investment within the companies. So that's something that we remain hopeful of. And I think if you're a citizen or an activist in a country that's not a strong economy in that sense and does not have the same power or leverage towards companies, there's lots of really, really great initiatives that you can still work to, like you said, right, Illinois, having that collective voice, so you can still put pressure on companies if you feel like there's not enough effort being put towards the local context that you're coming from. I know that this is something that the Christchurch call is also working towards, like elevating those voices so you can collectively still put pressure on companies to be responsive to your context, even if you might not have a government that's willing to do so.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Mia. Camilo?
Yeah, also, if I understand correct, but I would like to do like some comment because I hear also what he said about the digital literacy. I think that is very important also to answer that, because I would like to remark that sometimes we focus with big tech companies or this kind of a stakeholder private sector. They are focusing a lot on invest in STEAM abilities, which is good because it's quite of digital skills. But I think we are forgetting that also these small countries that we are doing some kind of processes, we are also need this digital rights perspective, right? Because sometimes they only believe that we are gonna do another kind of machine, we have to learn programming, we have to learn like very technical skills, but we are really forgetting something very important, that is the digital rights perspective, seeing that the internet as a right, seeing the internet as a civic space, a digital space, a safe space. So I think it's sometimes big techs don't allow us to talk in that way. Sometimes it's just about technical skills, and I would like to close with that we also have the small communities. They have the right also to be in that kind of speeches. Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, Camilo. So, technology companies and governments, the Millennial Manager would like to have a word with you about digital rights and democracy. This has been a great panel. Mia, Camilo, Elonnai, Nadia, thanks so much for coming all this way to share your wisdom with us. Round of applause for our panelists, and thank you.
Who